to steal a legend. Lost in the labyrinth of a Paleolithic cavern complex, Indy Jones encounters references to a mythological beast that may have existed 20,000 years ago. And 5 years later, Dr. Jones confronts the legend again, and the woman who is hoping to find the fabled unicorn's horn. But so is someone else from Indy's past, a man who will stop at nothing to obtain the ancient relic. Some say the unicorn's horn came from an animal made extinct by the Great Flood. Others say the horn is an effective antidote to poison and a mystical relic. Indy discovers that the horn's power is less than benevolent, and the same could be said about the intentions of a certain beautiful art historian. To possess it meant power. To seek it meant death. Indiana Jones and the Unicorn's Legacy.
Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the fifth in the series of Bantam novels based on the iconic Indiana Jones and the Unicorn's Legacy by Rob MacGregor. This follows in keeping with everything I've discussed about MacGregor's previous Indy novels, so it has pretty much a lot of the same core themes. And once again, the greatest benefit of reading these is MacGregor's excellent handle on Indy's characterization that's developing, because this is still a prequel to the films. So each book basically has sort of building blocks of Indy's character, and you can see how through these events that he's gone through, it leads from the younger Indy we start with in the early 1920s in these books, and builds to the Indy we start seeing in the films around Temple and Raiders in 1935-1936. So Unicorn's Legacy does thankfully follow suit with what MacGregor did with his fourth novel, really, in terms of getting away from the sort of trilogy of his first three books, kind of building up his book Indy world, if you will. And while I think it's really good to read those three books back to back, because they do very much they do build on each other, they do have some connections, but you can still read them out of order, but like I did growing up, but it helps to read them together. MacGregor's fourth, fifth, and sixth books, because he wrote 6 Indy novels, they're very much standalone adventures with some mention of the previous books and some recurring characters, but they are very much standalone works that you can read separately. And they do have basically, MacGregor started with Seven Veils, his third Indy book, really having a better sense of pace and not letting the books kind of get slogged down in certain sections, and kind of forcing the action and most of the development of the plot into shorter sections, or having to make you wait a while, or spending more time on characterization and setup before we got to the main thrust of the plot. Well, in Genesis Deluge, his fourth book, I thought that was a real nice improvement, because that book did have a good sense of pulpy flavor that you need in every pulp adventure, but it also moved much more quickly. So I felt that book it was much easier to pick up and just get into, and you didn't have to sort of force yourself along in certain passages like you do more in the first three books. And again, starting with Seven Veils, you can get a sense that the pacing is increasing, and then that's furthered in Genesis Deluge, and that helps to sort of smooth out some of the bits of the story that you might not like as much, because the pacing is nice, so you can just continue on with the adventure, even though you start to kind of wonder about certain things. And it's really when you finish the book that you then kind of go back and wonder about certain sequences and things. But again, the increased pace really does help things. You do have that here in Unicorn Legacy, but unfortunately it does... It kind of goes in fits and spurts in terms of when the book really gets going, and then it kind of just goes off on a different path that's unexpected. We do have the return of what MacGregor likes to do to open the books. He usually likes to open with a sort of prologue, either a historical event that we don't know the context of, but it will tie in usually to the artifact or MacGuffin of the book. Once we get further into the book, we realize that the opening historical prologue actually is about someone who usually encountered said artifact hundreds of years before. or he likes to open with some sort of event for Indy, well, he started doing that in the first book by having a flash forward to a particular danger moment, and then, you have to read the rest of the book to get to that point. But then he switched to basically doing little small adventures, but either before the story occurs or, as in Unicorn Legacy here, an event with certain characters that takes place several years before the book starts, and then Indy basically re-encounters these characters in starting in chapter 1 of the main book a couple years later. So Unicorn Legacy opens with not one of these, but two. So we have two prologues here. The first is someone encountering the artifact, which is supposedly an alicorn or a unicorn's horn. Some people seem to think it is merely a nicely, intricately carved piece of twisted ivory with certain symbols and writings engraved on it. And it seems to perhaps contain magical properties. And it sets up right there in the prologue that sort of fascinating idea that people who come into possession of this alicorn seem to have a whole run of good fortune, but then I guess seemingly the longer they hold it, that good fortune turns to bad fortune. So it's an object that may have magical powers, but it may also be a cursed object. Whether you put stock in that or not, it basically puts a whole spin on the sort of artifact that may have magical properties that villains or anyone would desire, because it's quite possible it could also destroy you. So it's an interesting sort of double-edged sword aspect to the MacGuffin of this story. And we get this interesting idea set up in the prologue because you have somebody whose life is destroyed, essentially, trying to get rid of this thing and telling their son, so their offspring, the next generation, to get rid of it, destroy it somehow. And of course, when that cuts off, you know that it's very likely that said son did not destroy said alicorn that supposedly may have caused the ruination of his father. Then we jump into the second prologue, which is actually set in 1924. So that actually places it before a lot of the events of the previous three books, especially before Indy's marriage to Deirdre in the third book, and really before the adventuring career as started by MacGregor in his novels got going. So this is sort of it's basically another sort of miniature prequel adventure, but it's set somewhere before the events of all of the previous books. So you have to keep that in mind, that the opening sort of mini adventure with Indy is set in 1924. And so if you're wondering why is he a bit more brash here, you have to remember it's set a couple years earlier. But this is set at an archaeological dig site where Indy is sort of butting heads with the guy leading the expedition, whose name is Walcott, who is basically up to no good and entirely motivated by monetary and personal gain. And it just so happens that there, of course, is a beautiful woman in the camp named Mara Rogers, who is a studier of ancient artwork, and they're there ostensibly to find cave paintings and rock drawings. Well, Indy manages to basically discover an unknown area that is filled with priceless works of ancient artworks and cave drawings and things. And of course, he does this by nearly getting himself killed because he thinks it's a good idea to check a cave they didn't think was passable by swimming in an icy mountain cave river that goes underground. And then Indy barely manages to escape that and finds this area, and then goes and tries to alert people, takes Mara back there because they can't find Walcott, who of course has found another entrance and has decided to keep everything for himself and try to sell it off. And this leads to a confrontation where Walcott is seemingly killed off, but of course they never find the body, and that's how all these characters meet. And it's a nice little sort of opening sequence with a good amount of action, great amount of characterization, and it feels like a nice sort of little indie adventure. So then we jump forward to chapter 1 of the book, which actually takes place in the main setting of 1928. So we have that little prologue in 1924, and now we jump back to 1928, where Indy has gone through all the events of the MacGregor 4 novels up to this point. So this is still Indy dealing with the events of those. He's obviously a bit more over the death of his wife Deirdre at the end of Seven Veils, and he's over, more over the events of Genesis Deluge as well. He's finally seemingly getting back on terms with his own life, and he's starting to enjoy teaching, and he's still, obviously great friends with Marcus Brody, but he's basically starting to find his way in the world a little bit after, especially in Genesis Deluge, he was basically kind of reeling after Deirdre's death and not sure where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do, and he quit his teaching job and things. So he's basically kind of gotten on some solid footing, and he's sort of found himself in a way. But he gets an invitation from Mara. They've kept up written correspondence sporadically through the years, but she invites him out to the southwest, where she's looking at various cave paintings and rock art drawings and formations and carvings. And Indy thinks it would be a fun sort of thing to go out there and get some fresh air and meet up with her, and of course see where things take them. Of course, things don't go to plan. As soon as he gets out there, basically he sent a telegram saying that she can't make it anymore, and so that greatly disappoints him, and he decides to go on the planned trip anyway. And Indy's out there and has called on his old friend Jack Shannon from the previous novels. So Jack Shannon reappears here as, sort of just somebody for Indy to talk to for a bit. And after his development in the previous book, he's still very much now a very religious convert. He likes to carry his Bible around, and he's just there to hang out with Indy, and he's not really looking forward to like an entire month of sitting in the desert while Indy looks at rock carvings. So he's kind of bored. But this doesn't last for very long, because there is obviously a third party involved in this area, and who is very interested in what Mara Rogers is doing. Mara did not send said telegram to Indy, and she's still going on the sort of expedition she was interested in. But she also seems to have an ulterior motive, because she's actually seeking this fabled lost unicorn's horn, or alicorn, which actually was passed down through her family, and her family actually lives in the small town around the desert area, and she's sort of estranged from them, and they have a rather interesting dynamic. But the third party intervenes and not only kills Mara's guide, but actually kidnaps her and is the one also searching for the alicorn. Indy becomes involved with this because essentially people figure out that Indy's in the area, and while Indy is up on one of the sides of the cliff, Jack Shannon was he had decided to play around with Indy's hat and whip, which of course leads people to think that he is Indiana Jones at a distance, so they grab him, and so Jack Shannon is now kidnapped along with Mara, and Indy has to not only get back to town, figure out what happened, and try and rescue them both with the assistance of Mara's estranged father, but also discover the story of the alicorn, its seemingly mystical properties, and figure out exactly who is the one behind all the nefarious actions. That, of course, turns out to be, unsurprisingly, the return of Walcott, who did survive from the opening. And again, it's not a surprise, because it's pretty much told as soon as this stuff starts happening, and you can already kind of tell that Walcott's going to come back somewhere here. But he is actually operating and trying to find this alicorn for a mysterious Italian individual who seems very much obsessed with the story of the alicorn, which does have some ties to various moments in Italian history, and he wants it for his own personal reasons and has merely hired Walcott to recover it due to his knowledge of antiquities and his past history with Mara, because she is the one who knows ostensibly where the unicorn's horn may be. The bonus for Walcott is, of course, he gets to deal with both Mara and now Indiana Jones as well. So this actually is a pretty nice, interesting sort of setup. And since we're in a Southwest setting, you could actually imagine this, in a slightly different time period as a sort of Western story. If there was a particular object or artifact or hidden gold cache or treasure or something that everybody was going after, you could see this as a Western. So that's where I thought the book was going. However, after this sort of setup and the plot of the book starting to get into motion, and I'm like, okay, we're going somewhere with this. Then we start introducing more and more elements of the mystical, metaphysical, supernatural, because Indy not only encounters things that seem to suggest that, but an entire character who is seemingly a sort of magical medicine man type of the Native American characterization that you see in a lot of fiction pop up. And it's alluded to and then finally confirmed this is actually the same man who assisted Indy when he was young on his vision quest. And this is a theme, motif, and idea that MacGregor established first a little bit in his Last Crusade novelization, that when Indy was younger, he went on a vision quest and saw that an eagle was his protector figure. And this has actually popped up in his past novels. So this is something you see recurring, and along with Jack Shannon reappearing, this is the thing that's going to most closely link this book to the previous books. I think Indy going on a vision quest is perfectly fine. I think that's a great thing for Indy's character, and I think that makes sense. The problem is this goes beyond this in this book, and we have Indy continually noticing, experiencing, and going through things that are way into the supernatural, to the point that the sort of mystical character can appear out of thin air and seems to be able to transmogrify himself into animals and other forms. And then, if that were not enough, Indy decides it's going to be a good idea that when he's sort of worn down, Indy will drink a cup of tea that the medicine man type figure has left for him. And of course, the guy is nowhere to be seen. And then we actually get treated to an entire sequence in the book where basically the tea has obviously something in it, and Indy experiences a whole sort of crazy vision experience where eventually he finds himself also sort of transmogrified into an eagle, flying around with the other eagle and doing all this stuff. And so basically, for most of a chapter, Indy is tripping balls. I just find that concept hilarious. And of course, is seeing things that are supposedly going to link to or give ideas or clues to things that will happen in the rest of the story. And so, again, this is a sort of vision he's going on. But then he wakes up outside the house, I think with his shirt off in the morning, in the middle of the desert, on the hood of the car they have there. So, again, basically, you have a whole sequence where Indy is tripping balls and thinks he's an eagle flying around, and so that was unexpected. That's my real issue with this book. That after, I'd say, the first, I'd say roughly 50 pages. After the first 50 pages or so, it kind of starts to meander, and you basically have Indy. Usually with Smitty, who is the estranged father of Mara, wandering around the desert in various places, trying to find the kidnapped Jack and Mara, and then they wind up recovering Jack Shannon. And then they're constantly going out into the desert trying to find Mara and Walcott, and then trying to find the medicine man character, and then going back into town and learning more about the unicorn's horn. And there's just a lot of back and forth, and just like a lot of going around. And so the majority of the book is actually these random events with a lot of wandering around, and then it's like occasionally sort of broken up by having more visions or finding out more about the unicorn's horn, or having an action set piece where they go up against the villains, and there's some shootouts and some punch ups and things, and then they kind of all just like break up and then wind up wandering around some more, discovering a little bit more, and then meeting up again and having another punch up and things. So it's kind of unfortunate because, again, the book gets off to a really good start, and then we get to this setup after the 2 prologues that, actually seems like this could be really solid. It's going to be a smaller story, so you think, in terms of the setting, locale, not a lot of globetrotting. The other things I should point out, Jack Shannon being here, it's fine that, Indy basically calls him up because he's sort of nearby, and Jack comes down to hang out for the summer, but he doesn't really do anything in terms of servicing the plot of the story. And if you were to take him out of this book and just give those actions to Indy and sort of streamline things a bit, I think it might have actually improved things a little bit, because, again, Jack Shannon is kind of just superfluous in this story, and then he just disappears for the ending, because there is a shift for the sort of final act of the book. So when I finished, I kind of thought about it, and I realized, well, he didn't really accomplish much in this, and if it had just been Indy going around the desert, we might have gotten to other events more quickly. And also, this whole act and section goes on so long that it starts to kind of bog down really fast. And I think it definitely should have been, again, streamlined, shortened a bit, tightened up overall, because it takes so long to actually get to the potential resting place of the alicorn, and Indy having to try to recover it and trying to save Mara and defeat Walcott and his goons and things. That by that point you've kind of been waiting for this so long that then it's just kind of like, oh, that's it. And also we have more of the sort of supernatural elements, and with the desert setting and the things Indy's seeing, I couldn't help but kind of be reminded of the ending of McKenna's Gold, with the sort of aspects of the slight supernatural and seeing sort of visions in the desert. So that was maybe an influence here. But then if that were, if that was all of what the book had to offer, then I think it definitely would have been, obviously a little bit disappointing, but that's what we're led to believe, that once we get to the end of this climactic scene, that's going to be the end of the book, and this would just be a smaller scale story. But oh no, we're over the 200 page mark by this point, and then all of a sudden, after the recovery of the artifact, then seemingly out of nowhere, we get multiple double crosses, and that just felt very sudden. We get several deaths, several double crosses, and then suddenly, I believe it's like page 223 or something, suddenly that section is over, and Indy's lost the artifact, and then suddenly, for the last, for the next 40 some odd pages, which is basically the end of the book, we go to Rome, and now we're technically dealing with the Italian character who was the backer of Walcott, who desired the alicorn. And this, of course, is in 1920s Italy, which is already seeing the rise of Mussolini. And then we find out that this character, who was sort of in the background, is actually I guess technically a sort of mob head who also wants to take over and control Italy themselves and stop Mussolini, and thinks that the alicorn will assist him in doing so by giving him a certain allure over the Italian people to allow him to basically do this. And that's actually a good setup for an Indy villain, and that makes sense. And there's a lot of action in this 40 pages. And unfortunately, like what I've felt with some of MacGregor's previous Indy books, especially this kind of feels like the ending of Seven Veils, where we kind of take like a sudden left turn with the Lost City, and there's all these developments that happen, and it goes too fast to process it. And after the much slower chunk of the book that led up to this, it's kind of like, whoa, wait, where's this coming from? And then suddenly it's over. Here in Unicorn's Legacy, you've got that, because we go from wandering around in the desert for the majority of the book, to suddenly all this action and back and forth, trying to steal the alicorn, trying to get it out secretly, and seeing the potential villain plot actually succeed, and seeing where it could go, and seeing the power this man exudes over people when he gives a speech and actually has the alicorn that he's pretending is a cane, and what this does. It's quite chilling, and again, that could have been the book in and of itself, and honestly probably should have been, or at least more of the book, because all this is crammed into 40 pages, and Indy is still dealing with Mara, who's also in Rome, and we even have Marcus Brody involved a little bit, and there's some nice subterfuge where they're basically trying to get themselves ingratiated with the people around the sort of antiquity circle in Rome to then potentially try and steal back the alicorn. And if all of this sounds like fun, it is. And again, the problem is it's in the last 40 pages of the book, and I'm like, why couldn't we have been going through this stuff instead of wandering around the desert for the last 150 pages or so? Actually, I think it's a little bit more than that. And then there's even a torture sequence. Indy gets tortured and pretty ragged by what the villain is trying to uncover information wise. Indy has tried to substitute a false alicorn. There's a lot of fun stuff here, but again, when suddenly this comes to an end, it's kind of, it's very rushed, and suddenly you're like, wait, oh, so now we're done with this part? Okay. And then we go back to the desert for basically an epilogue that's, basically 3.5 pages, where Indy essentially tries to sort of close the rift he has caused and provide closure to the story. So I'm definitely glad that epilogue was there, because if the book had just ended with that sort of abrupt flurry of action at the end of the Rome sequence, it would have definitely felt like the ending was abrupt. Just as had the book ended with the end of the desert sequence before we got to the Rome section, it definitely would have also felt abrupt. So it at least does have a okay ending, and I loved the whole Rome sequence. It was just, that should have started at least at, I'd say, maybe the halfway point in the book, and distilled down all the action and wandering around in the desert to, maybe half to 3/4 the length it was. But that's the real problem here. And again, I think there was too much of the sort of mystical supernatural visions Indy was having, and it was a bit much for the whole Indy having a vision and kind of tripping balls overnight sequence. So it made me very much when I finished this book, it made me very much kind of wonder, what did I just read? That was the sort of feeling I had. That's not to say that this was a bad book or a book that wasn't enjoyable, but it does have that sort of quality of kind of going in fits and spurts when things really get going, or there's an action sequence, or the plot is moving along at a good clip. You can get on board with it, and you're like, okay, I'm invested in what's going on. This is a good setup. So again, I'd say the first 45, maybe 50 pages with the 2 prologues and everything, it sets up the story well. We're going somewhere. The MacGuffin of the alicorn is nicely set up, and it's very interesting, and we get the history of it and the sort of history of what has happened to all of these potential alicorns over the years. But then everything just kind of gets bogged down in the desert, with a lot of wandering around, a lot of going back and forth from town to, random places out in the desert, and then meeting up with the villains and having a sort of battle, and then going away, and then coming back, and then searching for characters we've already encountered because now we can't find them, and then there's a lot of backtracking in all of this. Essentially, it's like when you're playing a video game and you're having to constantly backtrack because it's the design of the game, and that gets very tedious if there's nothing to do, or it's a lot of the same things you've already done. That's kind of the feeling you get, and unfortunately this is the majority of the book. So it makes the Rome sequence at the end a nice refresher, but again, you wish that was longer, and that's kind of rushed. So I think it would have been better overall had the Rome sequence really started, basically at the halfway point. I think that really would have made for a better reading experience. And you could have started that even earlier, because that could have been a whole book in and of itself, and the stuff in the desert could have been a prologue to the story in Rome. I do like the Mara character as a potential new love interest for Indy. I like that they have a past history with each other as set up in the prologue. While Walcott coming back is a bit coincidental, it's also set up by the technically the real villain of the story, hiring him because of his past history and his knowledge of Mara in the past and his antiquities knowledge and things. So it makes sense why he's there. It just feels a little bit obvious because we got him in the prologue and we know he's going to show up. So of course, when he does, it's no surprise. Again, Indy's characterization is the best thing in this book, and that is the one thing MacGregor has absolutely down cold and is the best aspect of all of these books. So even though these usually have a mixed reputation among a lot of Indy fans or people who read them, and some people prefer some much more than others, you can't knock them for their characterization because it is perfectly on point. And you can see how each of these books, whether you put them in your personal Indy canon or not, you can see how they build on each other, and you can see how they build up Indy as a character to the Indy of the film. So then when you see Indy and Raiders, you can imagine that among the many adventures of his past that have made him the man he is in the film, you can imagine that some of them were these Rob MacGregor novels. So it fits within the sort of character continuity. And I do like the prologue being set earlier in 1924, before some of the previous books, and then we jump forward to 1928 to then be the fifth in these books. So I like that having that sort of jump in time does make it really grounded in who Indy is in terms of this point of his life as a character in 1928. So unfortunately, I think Unicorn's Legacy is very much a mixed bag, and I think your results are very much going to vary in terms of what you appreciate in these books and whether or not you'll enjoy this one. I do think it is, again, I think you can tell MacGregor kind of finds his stride starting with Seven Veils. So, again, it varies very much with the individual reader, which of the MacGregor books you might prefer. I do think this has a lot of the strengths of Seven Veils and the sort of confidence that you feel more in Genesis Deluge, but it does bog down more than Genesis Deluge does. So I don't think it maintains the same sort of pacing that smooths over some issues I had with that book. So I think this one, the majority middle section, unfortunately does kind of become a bit of a slog, and there's so much back and forth, and then you've got all the mystical visions and things which do kind of feel very much out of place. A little bit is fine, but I think it's just a bit too much. It's kind of a weird experience. I think it's full of good ideas. It has good sequences. It has great characterization for Indy, but I just wish it was more focused, and I wish the Rome section hadn't been crammed in at the very end and was really the second half of the book. I think that would have been the better idea, and I think that would resolve a lot of the issues I had. I also don't think the double crosses at the end of the main act of the book were necessary, and I think one was okay, but having two and they were just seemingly out of nowhere, it just made it feel very much, it felt very abrupt, and it was very much the rug was being pulled out from under the reader, because I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. So, because I had read 223 some odd pages, and suddenly where it's like, wait, what? What? And now we're going to Rome? Oh, okay. So it's an interesting experience. It's a bit of an odd experience for sure, and I don't think it's the best of the MacGregor novels, but it does have some of the strengths of Seven Veils and Genesis Deluge as compared to the first two books. So you can tell this is the fifth book in the series, especially if you're reading them chronologically, and you can tell how the style kind of grows over the books. But I think that unfortunately this is very much a mixed bag. Now we'll look at the book itself. Again, an absolutely gorgeous Drew Struzan painting. I mean, this just looks fantastic, and he's even worked the alicorn into the actual cover. The title font, the text, everything looks great. And of course, this has a wraparound effect because it goes over to the spine. And then on the rear, all of these usually have some sort of expansion of the background. But as you can see in the clouds, Struzen has worked in the figure of a unicorn. So I think this looks absolutely gorgeous. The only thing is this actual scene with Indy seemingly carrying Mara in his arms. As to my recollection, this doesn't exactly happen in the book. They both get injured at various points, but I don't quite remember Indy carrying Mara in the sort of heroic posture way as depicted on the cover. But it just looks fantastic. So one of the things that makes these books so collectible and why it's such a shame they're not in print is they all have amazing Drew Struzan artwork. Now, this is a slightly later printing in terms of the actual date. It seems to be a 7th printing. The original came out in 1992, of course, but you can always tell the later printings because they don't have the embossing on the title or the Indy logo, and instead of being a Bantam Falcon book, they just have the standard Bantam imprint. There's still some nice gloss on the paperback cover, but that's how you can tell that you don't have a first printing. It's on the Bantam label itself, and it doesn't have the fancy embossing. As I like to point out, the actual book blurb says and uses the name of Indy Jones. That's something I like about these books that seems to be unique because usually you just see Indy or you see Indiana Jones. You don't see Indy Jones. And there's something about that seems to just suggest this being a prequel and this being the not fully formed Indiana Jones. By saying Indy Jones, he is still growing. He's a younger man, and it does suggest this obviously being set in the 20s as a prequel. And I just like how they did that. Later printings did change some of those to say Indiana Jones, but it's just one of those unique signifiers that kind of looks weird at first, but then you kind of get accustomed to it, and I just like pointing that out. And then lastly, as with all of these books, all of the chapters start with this figure of the eagle, which I believe is meant to symbolize Indy's protecting sort of visualization or symbol figure of the eagle. So you get that in all the MacGregor books at the start of each chapter. You get that same image. So those are my overall thoughts on Indiana Jones and the Unicorn's Legacy, the 5th of the Bantam novels and the 5th written by Rob MacGregor. While I think, unfortunately, this is very much a mixed book in terms of overall quality, I like the plot idea. I love the setup, and the MacGuffin is really well done. I like a lot of the set pieces, and I really like the ending Rome sequence, which I think should have been much more of what the book was, and really taken up a much more significant portion of the book. I like the idea of the 2 prologues and the sort of returning figure from Indy's past that may become his new love interest, and I like where Indy finds himself at this point in his life after the events of the previous novels. So there's a lot to like here, and if you like elements of the previous books, you will like those elements returning here, and it is linked in some ways to the previous books, so it does feel part of the same series. It's just unfortunate that I think some of the negative aspects of the previous books that I'm not a big fan of kind of return here and kind of are in much more obvious effect. So I think, unfortunately, all of those really detract from the overall effectiveness of the book. And when you read this for the first time, I think you're going to come away with at least definitely some degree of just going, I'm scratching my head because I don't quite know what I just read. That's definitely the feeling I got. So if you've read this before, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Unfortunately, all the Indy books are out of print, and they have gotten very difficult to find. It took me quite some time to find decent and good condition copies at decent prices over the years. So that's why I waited so long to finally read all of them chronologically. So this is just the fifth in my overall video review series of these books. I think they're very rewarding for Indy fans, whether you like them or not, or you prefer some and over others, because again, MacGregor would write the first six, and then other authors came in to do the other books and had different styles and tones. Regardless of your preferences, I think they are very much thought-provoking. And especially here in these books and the MacGregor novels, the sense of Indy's characterization is so solid and well done that even if you don't like all of these, you can envision them as part of Indiana Jones's collective past and adventures and elements that help to build the character we know and love. So they feel part of Indy's world and his background, even if some elements are, maybe a bit off or too much, and other elements make the overall result of reading the books in terms of the plot effectiveness feel a bit mixed or compromised, or not quite the Indiana Jones we think of in the films. And honestly, you kind of get used to that because these are Indy before the films and the character isn't quite 100% fully formed. So don't go into these thinking that you're going to get a book that's just like one of the films. These are still sort of building blocks, and they kind of take slightly different approaches. So they're not trying to do the approach and tone and style of the films, while they do at least have the sort of pulpy flavor and aspects. They are very much their own thing. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed my babblings about the world of Indiana Jones and books and printed media and sort of Indy outside of the films. I hope you found this at least somewhat fun and informative, and I do plan on returning soon with my thoughts on the final Rob MacGregor novel in this series, and then jumping over into the other authors' works of the Bantam Indy novels. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some good condition used copies of the Bantam Indiana Jones books. And as always, keep reading, and thank you ever so much for watching.